I'm very happy and honored to have been asked to give this keynote address to Stoicon-X New England 2020. We're in the year of virtual conferences, and so I've pre-recorded this in order to make sure there won't be any bandwidth issues, but also so I can share this with a larger worldwide audience after this conference has concluded, because the things that I'm going to talk about are in many respects quite timely and also perennial. I want to talk about Stoicism in the workplace. Now, the Stoics, of course, didn't talk an awful lot about workplaces in general, and they certainly didn't talk about the modern workplace, but many of the things that we can learn from them and apply will help us out within the workplaces that we are currently, doing our work in, and in many cases, for some of us, living in as well, those of us who are working from home. And many of us work in virtual contexts as well, where we're kind of, interconnected with others through this wonderful medium of the internet. Now, I do want to talk about a particular case that I think some of you may have already heard of. If you haven't, we're gonna run through it. And it has to do with somebody who got fired and then used Stoicism in order to justify his behavior in a way that really is quite non-Stoic or perhaps even anti-Stoic. And it made its way into the court system in Britain, and Stoicism is being now recognized as a protected category. So we're going to talk about what that means and whether or not this person was actually doing the right thing or arguably Stoic in his behavior. Answer, of course, is he was not at all. And we're going to be using this as a way to explore, well, how would you behave as a Stoic in the workplace? As it turns out, there's a lot of useful information in classic Stoic texts, and then we can also think out these matters, as we have to do as modern Stoics, in the present, adapting all of these things. So I'm going to talk a bit about the case, and then I'm also going to talk about some real basics that we want to keep in mind when we're thinking about Stoicism, or really any intentional way of living within the workplace. And then there's a number of what we can call Stoic points that I'm going to lead us through. So the first of these is whether, as Stoics, we should expect other people in the workplace to buy into Stoicism or not, and what the implications for that are. The second has to do with truth. The Stoics believe that human beings have an innate desire for truth and value truth, and there was an appeal to truth as something like a transcendent value in this workplace case. So we're going to look at what Stoics actually have to say about truth. Then we're also going to talk about something else that the Stoics thought was absolutely central to human beings, our social nature. We are social beings. There are a number of implications coming out of that for how we ought to live, work, think in the workplace. We're also going to talk about the workplace as, you might say, a field of things that the Stoics called externals or indifference, and whether that means that we should not care about them or whether that means that we need to be careful in how we're dealing with these matters. And then the second to last thing I want to talk about is something that I think we all need to keep in mind. Every once in a while, some of us need to be reminded of it a little bit more, which is that we're not the sage. We are the prokopton, or the proficiens, if we're using Greek or Latin, or you could say the Stoic in training and by aspiration. That means that we're constantly trying to work on ourselves, and that means we're gonna screw up. And so we should think about, well, what should we do when we screw up? What should we do when we make mistakes? Finally, I do want to address the issue that we absolutely have to bring up. What if you're in a workplace that's actually bad in some respects? Should you, as a Stoic, say, well, I'll just put up with it. This is really a great opportunity for me to train my Stoicism. Or should you say, well, this is actually exploitative, or this is abusive, and at a certain point, I should not have to put up with this. So we're going to talk about each of these points. I'm not going to try to cover everything in the depth or detail that it deserves. Obviously, each of these is something we could do a much longer talk about, but hopefully in the Q&A and discussion, we can explore this a bit more. The case that I have in mind to use here as, you might say, examples of how not to behave as a Stoic pertains to a firing of an employee whose name was Samuel Jackson. He worked for the Lidl Corporation as apparently a communications specialist, and he got fired because he engaged in some stereotyping, and it's not clear exactly when he did this. He may have said this out loud, he may have put this into an email. And he said some bad things about Asians as a entire class. I mean, this is a little bit of a side note. If you think about Asians, it's not a nationality. It encompasses everybody from the Indian subcontinent way up into, Northeast Asia. And so this is, quite a statement for him to make. I'm not going to repeat the statement because I don't want to engage in stereotyping like that. He was called out for that, and he was told he needed to apologize. And he gave what the corporation thought was an insufficient apology, and he was fired. Now notice, he's a communications person. So we have a role here in which you'd expect that this person would be cognizant of, the niceties of social conventions and how to communicate effectively and what not to say as well. So now it goes before courts, and here's where it gets particularly interesting. He claimed Stoicism as a pretext for what he had done in the workplace and why it was okay for him to do it. In the article in HR Review, it says, Stoic beliefs meant that he was bound to say what he liked without fear of offending other people. And he clarifies that what he wanted to say was what he thought to be the truth and without any repercussions. So he's making the case that what Stoicism really amounts to is such a great love for truth that you should say whatever is on your mind, if you think that it's true, without caring about how it's going to affect anyone else. Consequences in terms of how they might, view you. Consequences in terms of how those words might affect them. And so under the Equality Act of 2000 in Britain, Stoicism is now being considered a protected belief. Now, that's kind of interesting because it means that there will be other people making similar arguments and using Stoicism as a pretext for similar behavior in the workplace. In the court case, he actually said that the realization that the consequences of what I say would cause offense would not stop me from saying it. So here we're posed with a really interesting case. Did he get Stoicism right? Is he, in a certain respect, abusing Stoicism by claiming its mantle in order to avoid having to take any responsibility for his actions? These are questions that we can think out. A further one that we can think out if we've decided that he actually got things wrong is, well, what can we learn from this example of how not to behave in the workplace? Let's start with talking about some real basics, and this goes beyond Stoicism as such and would extend to any sort of virtue ethics tradition or wisdom tradition or any intentional way of living. I think there's four main things that we want to keep in mind when we're talking about the workplace and how we're applying a philosophy or way of life to it. So the first is how we should behave towards others. How should we treat other people in the workplace? So others is a key dimension. And then we can also talk about ourselves. How do we evaluate ourselves and how do we develop ourselves further into being, better and better people? Because that's what anything that counts as a virtue ethics ought to be guiding us towards, becoming better people, not just being complacent with who we currently are. And then there's two other vectors that we can talk about. We can talk about the work itself and our roles and our duties that come into play with that. And then we can talk about the overarching situation of the workplace itself, which can be understood as a domain of all sorts of personal interactions. We can also look at it as something like a community. It could be a very dysfunctional community. It could be a very well-coordinated one. And so these four dimensions, I think, are good to keep in mind. When you look at places where people are discussing Stoicism, one of the beginner mistakes that people bring up quite often, without meaning to necessarily, is making the assumption that because they've decided that they want to be a Stoic and they want to start practicing Stoicism, everybody else should be held to that as well. Everybody else should be viewed as if they're a Stoic. So they'll say, things like, well, you shouldn't be affected by the things that I'm saying because it's only your judgment that makes it hurtful to you. That is a very unstoic way to behave for several reasons. First of all, it's completely imprudent. Prudence is one of the key virtues of Stoicism, and to think that somehow because one has changed oneself a little bit, that everyone else in the world is going to change, that's complete foolishness, the opposite of prudence. It's also unjust. It's placing a burden on them that they don't actually deserve to have. And, there's other things that we can say about it as well. But one of the problems with this case is, I think, and I'm sort of reading this into this case, it sounds like Samuel Jackson is assuming that his co-workers really shouldn't be offended by his using ethnic stereotypes to characterize those who belong to that whole set of ethnicities, really, or anybody else who might say, well, that's the wrong thing to be doing in the workplace. I find that offensive because it's actually an unjust action that you're engaging in. And so it's this is, I think, something really worth keeping in mind. If you're going to try to be a Stoic in the workplace, do not expect other people to suddenly change their mentalities and become Stoic along with you. Epictetus actually tells us in the Enchiridion, if you're going to start being a Stoic, start being a philosopher, keep it to yourself for the time being until you've managed to work on yourself for a while. Samuel Jackson explained his actions by saying that, according to him, Stoicism meant that he had a duty or a right to speak the truth as he saw it, regardless of whether it would offend anybody or any other consequences. And he's partly right in that Stoicism does value truth. Truth is held to be something that is a good for human beings, something that we have an innate desire for. This is part of what allows Stoics to say that there's something like a natural law that would say that we should actually cultivate wisdom. It doesn't say that we have an automatic right or duty to speak our mind anytime. And as a matter of fact, one of the things, if you actually are a Stoic, that you should hold about truth is that you're probably wrong when it comes to a lot of the things that you think are true. Ethnic stereotypes are a great example of this. Claiming that one knows something about an entire swath of people and can say things about them, I mean, that should set off alarm bells for anybody who claims to be a Stoic. That's sort of like ding, ding, ding. Wow, I have some really screwed up preconceptions, right? I have some really screwed up judgments. I have some really screwed up opinions, and I'd better start working on these. And so this provides us with a good place to talk about what would an actual Stoic say about this. Well, the Stoics actually talked about disciplines. And Epictetus, as everyone knows, talks about the discipline of desire, the discipline of action or choice, and the discipline of assent. That entire discipline of assent is about how to get our ideas right and straight in our heads. Seneca talks about disciplines in a slightly different way. In letter 89, he says that ethics is divided into three branches. The first assigns to each thing its proper value and determines what it's worth. The second deals with impulse. The third deals with actions, right? The objective of ethics are to enable you to judge what each thing is worth, to enable you to entertain a well-adjusted and controlled impulse, and the third to enable you to achieve harmony between your impulse and action so you can be consistent. These would seem to say that this guy actually is not a Stoic. He's using Stoicism. He's actually untruthful about what Stoicism consists in. Another key aspect of this, and there's much more that could be said about this, is that, as Epictetus tells us, sticking with ideas stubbornly, doubling down on them, does not actually make you a Stoic or even rational. He gives us an example, somebody who made a really stupid decision and then pig-headedly stuck with it against any sort of, argument or counter evidence. And Epictetus says the resolve to stick with something against, say, any outside interference, that's only good if your ideas are actually true. Clearly, in this case, sticking with an ethnic stereotype and then doubling down by refusing to apologize properly about it, and then going to court and claiming that this is done because of Stoicism, that I think would fit under what Epictetus is talking about. Another key dimension of Stoic ethics is that we as human beings are social beings. We are not meant to be totally isolated from each other or to push others away. As a matter of fact, we're only really following the Stoic path when we can get along with other people. There are going to be obstacles, especially when other people have wrong-headed ideas, but we should make our best efforts to get along. So there's this pro-social nature, and this is something that the Stoics think that we ought to work on and expand. And there's a lot of different ways in which this can happen. We can talk about some of that in the Q&A. One key element of this is that justice is a virtue for Stoics. And justice doesn't just mean giving everybody what they deserve or honoring commitments that we make. It also involves, as Cicero, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus make crystal clear, beneficence or kindness, being good to other people, not doing things that are going to be hurtful to them. In fact, doing the opposite. So saying offensive things to other people is really going against this key teaching of Stoicism, and it's going against the virtue of justice. Another key aspect of this, particularly important in the workplace, is understanding our roles. Stoic ethics tells us that a good portion of our duties come from our roles, and these might even be included in our job description. For a person in communications, you would think that communicating effectively with other people and then being able to handle being told that you've got something wrong and course adjusting would be part of that. And this can apply to all of us. We all have different roles. As Epictetus reminds us, the role of Socrates is not the role of Diogenes, is not the role of Zeno. Socrates is supposed to go around and ask people questions. Diogenes is supposed to go around as a cynic and be kind of a jerk, but also teach people things. Zeno was a teacher, right? So each of us has our workplace roles, and we're supposed to be living up to them as best as we can. Another key thing that I think can come out of Stoic philosophy, and this is really there in Marcus Aurelius, who reminds himself about this over and over again, but also in Epictetus, is we can conceive of ourselves, while still remaining individuals, as parts of larger wholes, in which we have our part to play, and we only work well within that context by harmonizing with, as best we can, what other people are doing. And then I think we can also think about having proper emotional comportments towards our fellow workers. We shouldn't be contemptuous of them. We shouldn't try to, say things that are going to be offensive to them. Here I want to read a little passage from Marcus. He says, "Fit yourself into accord with the things in which your portion has been cast." And then he says, "And love the people among whom your lot has fallen, but love them truly." Be affectionate, be kind, be good to other people within the workplace. That is how a Stoic would approach dealing with matters in their relations with other co-workers, with customers, with supervisors, subordinates, all the people who we have to engage with. We should have the proper comportments towards them. One of the challenges for applying Stoicism within the workplace is looking at all the things that the workplace comprises and not jumping to the conclusion that none of it really matters from a Stoic perspective. As a matter of fact, it does matter, even though most of what we're dealing with do fall into what Stoics call the externals or the indifferents. The indifferents are things that don't make us either truly happy or truly miserable because they don't by themselves affect our moral goodness or moral badness. But they can certainly play a major role in it because what we do with the indifferents, how we deal with them, and how we make decisions in prioritizing about them, and also the work that we're engaged with, that does have an impact on us. So we can exercise the virtues of, for example, courage or fortitude or temperance or self-control in the way that we're dealing with things in the workplace. Do we stick with our work and diligently get through it, or do we slough off and, say things like, well, nobody's going to notice if I cut corners over here? That by itself may bear on something that is indifferent, but it has to do with our character. And likewise, the things that we say in some respects may be by themselves indifferent, but they have an effect on us. So it's very important to keep in mind that just because we say as Stoics that things like the amount of money that you're getting paid or the number of hours that you're putting in or the boxes that you fill or whatever it happens to be, that those things are strictly speaking indifferents. They can be preferred or rejected, and the use that we make of them is absolutely essential in whether we're going to become more virtuous or more vicious. One of the things that we need to bear in mind, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that if we're going to be Stoics, we cannot conceive of Stoicism as something like an on-off switch. You picked up the book and now you're a Stoic, or you began practicing and now you're a Stoic. Stoicism, you might say, is a continuum, and it's not even one where you necessarily are going to make steady progress. You're going to screw up. You're going to fail, you're going to fall, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to think that you've got things right, and then eventually reread something and get reminded that you've actually got some things off. You're mistaken about some things. And then what do we do in a case like that? Do we double down stubbornly on saying that we're the ones who've got it right? We stick with our truth or our claim that we're, loving truth and we have to say what we're going to say no matter what? Not really the Stoic thing to do. As a matter of fact, we have some very clear advice about these sorts of things. Marcus Aurelius tells us, when people screw up, we should tell them, here's where you're screwing up, and then leave it to them to decide. And when we screw up, we should be amenable to other people saying, man, you've really gone off the course. If I've gone off the course, I want to be corrected. Epictetus will talk about the incredible force that habit plays and why it's so important for us to devote attention to what's going on in the situations that we're in, that each time we have an opportunity for working on those habits, making them better, or if we're not paying attention and we choose the wrong things, for making them worse. And there's almost nothing worse than a wrong-headed idea about the truth and about how one ought to behave. The Stoics have a sense of compassion, you might say, for people who are so off that they think that acting like a jerk is the right way to be. So we can take that and think about ourselves. How should we behave towards our coworkers? How should we behave in relation to the work that we're doing? Are we measuring up to it? And we don't have to make ourselves overly anxious about that or obsess about it, but it's something that we should probably do as a continual check-in, and we probably want to do that with coworkers or colleagues whose judgment we trust, whether they're Stoics or not. One of the issues that we really do have to address, and I think because there's a lot of misunderstandings about this, deriving from, in a simplistic way, using some of the things Stoics actually do say, has to do with what we should put up with in workplaces when we're talking about things like abusiveness, manipulativeness, injustice, exploitation. There's a lot of things where we might say, oh, well, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius told us we can put up with anything if we just put our mind to it, and we're not really hurt by anybody, only by what we think is going on. There's a lot to that, and there are probably cases where we should say, well, I need to toughen up a bit. But there's a lot of cases where we shouldn't actually make that our go-to. There's plenty of cases where people are genuinely unjust, where there's workplace bullying, where there's clear inequities, where people are being treated in ways that they shouldn't. And the Stoic thing to do in those cases, particularly if it involves others to whom we have some sort of responsibility, is to take a stand, to say, this is wrong, this is unjust. That is indeed part of the virtue of justice, to take the right stands. It also requires fortitude or courage to do so. It also requires prudence or wisdom. And so by doing that, we're behaving virtuously. In our own case, there are lines that we shouldn't allow people to cross. Not because, as Stoics, we can't possibly handle it. In some cases, maybe we can, maybe we can't. As I pointed out, we're all in development, so there's going to be places where people can get their hooks into us, right, and provoke us in certain ways. If we know that's the case, we should lay down lines where we say, this is not okay, this is okay. And then hopefully coach people how to get from this is not okay to this is okay, or do what we need to do in order to move them out of that workplace. If we're the ones engaging in that, we need to fix ourselves. We need to work on ourselves. And so to come back to this case, Samuel Jackson was wrong to engage in any sort of ethnic stereotyping, particularly when he had a role to be a communications person. He was doubly wrong to use Stoicism as an excuse to double down and refuse to give a proper apology. Right? He should have been working on his character in that case and saying, oh, I've screwed up. I need to fix this. The judge was wrong to accept Samuel Jackson's on its face claim that he was a Stoic and that this is what Stoicism was. The judge probably didn't do his due diligence in researching whether the behavior and the justification actually map onto Stoicism. But we should think about what we're willing to go along with and what we should allow to happen to others, particularly others who are not claiming to be Stoics or not trying to be Stoics. They are in some respects more vulnerable, and to be a just person means to take care of them in the workplace as well. So Stoicism is not going to say put up with anything whatsoever, whether it's abusive or exploitative. They would say, of course, use the reserve clause. Don't expect that when you tell somebody that they've done something wrong, they're automatically going to have the result that you want, or that making rightful criticisms is automatically going to produce a changed workplace. But we ought to prudently, justly, courageously stand up against wrong behavior. And so to bring this to a close, I hope that you found this useful. We covered a couple main points of Stoicism. I think that this case shows us, in many respects, interesting things about how not to be a Stoic, what not to claim. And hopefully it also guides us to understanding a little bit better how to be a Stoic and what that would look like within the contemporary workplace.